Good morning and welcome to this public debate on the fundamental questions concerning the green transition strategy. What a sustainable transition can and should do for Europe. I'm Brian Maguire, Brussels-based and Washington-based journalist. I'm delighted to be back in Brussels for this event. We have a great panel, distinguished speakers with us today, but let me welcome our former members of the European Parliament, our expert panelists, and you, our audience as well across Europe. We're delighted you've taken the time to be with us today, and we hope that you stay with us during the course of this morning. There's lots of different perspectives to be heard, but also you have a lot of opportunity to put questions to our panelists. And we want you to get started and put those questions in as quickly as possible, and we'll bring those to our speakers a bit later on as well. So this event is for you. Please make every opportunity to participate in it as well. So this is the last appointment of a cycle of events entitled Together for the Future of Europe. It's organized by the former Members Association with the academic expertise provided by the European Political Foundations and the European University Institute in Florence. The objective has been to open up the debate on crucial issues in the framework of the ongoing conference on the future of Europe. And this event is also on the platform of the conference on the future of Europe. So please send your questions and also like and share our comments, your messages on Twitter and the Facebook accounts and the Zoom platform Q&A as well through the Facebook Live page. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished president of the former Members Association, Hans-Gert Pöttering. He's also former president of the European Parliament. Hans-Gert, great to see you again.
Thank you, Brian, and nice to see you again and all of you, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the European Parliament Former Members Association, I would like to welcome current members of the European Parliament, our colleagues, the former members of the European Parliament, our speakers and the public, which today includes many university students and professors who cooperated with us in the framework of the EP to Campus program. A year ago, our association decided to accompany the debates on the future of Europe with a series of initiatives. We felt that it is our duty and responsibility to give our contribution. We had the ambition to reach out to and involve citizens, in particular the youngest generation, promoting a plural debate with the support of academic institutions and media, making use of the valuable expertise of our European former parliamentarians. This is the fourth and final appointment of our series of conferences, and we close it with a fundamental question: what a sustainable transition can and should do for Europe. Many young people are connected today, and I invite them to express their reflections and possible questions throughout the discussions. I am particularly grateful to those organizations that agreed to follow us in this journey and provide us with their academic knowledge and expertise. The European University Institute in Florence, a long-standing partner of the former Members Association, and the European Political Foundations. Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, European Progressive Studies Foundation, European Liberal Forum, and Green European Foundation. I warmly welcome its co-president, Mr. Dirk Hollemans, who will participate in our second panel. Let me add that today the European political foundations play a key role in connecting the European and national political sphere, and we are very glad of this cooperation. This is the only way to build a free and informed consensus about the decisions taken on a European level on crucial issues for European citizens. We all need to be architects and in control of the development of our communities and economies. Allow me to thank all the eminent experts who are with us today and our moderator, Brian Maguire. After the opening session, Brian will introduce our speakers and will animate the debate. Please allow me in particular to introduce our special guest speaker who will open the conference, Klaus Welle, who has been the Secretary General of the European Parliament for 12 years now, heading the Parliament's administration. I want to sincerely thank you, Klaus, for being with us today. It was a special year for us. Our association celebrates its 20th anniversary, And I want to thank the European Parliament, the President, the Secretary General, and all people who helped us for this continuous support and valuable cooperation over the last 20 years. Yesterday, the first EP Vice President, Roberta Metsola, had sincere words of appreciation for the work carried out by the former Members Association. I want to say a few words concerning the profile of the Secretary General of Klaus Welle. He got a degree in economics from the University of Witten-Herdecke in Germany. He is a recipient of grants from the Students' Foundation of the German people and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, student sponsorship from the Westdeutsche Landesbank. His professional experience, 1984 to 1986, banking studies, Westdeutsche Landesbank in Münster. 1986-87, military service with the Luftwaffe. So that's the Bundeswehr in the air. 1991 to 1994, head of the European and Foreign Policy Department at the CDU Central Office, at that time still in Bonn. 1994 to 1999, Secretary General of the European People's Party, EPP, and the European Union of Christian Democrats in Brussels. 1999 to 2003, Secretary General of the EPP ED group in the European Parliament. ED stands for the British Conservatives, who still were then in the group of the European People's Party. So here in Brussels. 2004 to 2007, Director General for Internal Policies in the European Parliament here in Brussels. 2007 to 2009, Head of the Cabinet of the President of the European Parliament here in Brussels. Since the 15th of March 2009, Klaus Welle is the Secretary General of the European Parliament, and that's officially in Luxembourg. But so he travels always between Luxembourg and Brussels, but I think you are mainly here in Brussels. I'm now eager to listen to you, Klaus Welle, to you, Klaus, and look forward to an interesting and informative debate. Please, Klaus, take the floor.
Yes, thank you very much, Hans-Gert, for this very kind introduction. For what is just a couple of opening remarks. First, I would like to welcome everybody and thank you also for your engagement, not only for today, but for the whole series you are organizing. I would maybe like to start with the following remark. When we look at political systems, some political systems are focused on the past, others are focused on the present, and others on the future. I remember still vividly about 30 years ago in the Balkan, when you went there, the main debate was who did what against whom in 1300 something. So a lot of the energy went into the past. It's also true that in our member states, a lot of the daily politics is about the present. And I think it can be said, it's fair to say, that the European Commission, at least in this legislature, is firmly focused on the future. The Commission, again, has a very clearly identifiable program for what it wishes to do, with the first focus on climate change, on digital, and I think we can also say, trying to find out what does it exactly mean, European sovereignty. So we have clearly identifiable goals again for the European Union, which is the precondition for citizens to understand what is on the agenda. The post-1989 world, so the post-collapse of the Eastern system and the Soviet Union, is over. The unilateral moment of American dominance is over. The time of the peace dividend is over. We see tensions building up everywhere, but the problem is that green and climate change needs global cooperation. What we are seeing for the moment is unfortunately the opposite. I think it is a fair description to say that the conflict between the United States and China, and maybe the West and China, that remains to be seen, will restructure all policy fields in times to come. And there's nearly no day where we don't have a new sign about that this is true. The latest was the decision of the United States to not participate on a political level at the Beijing Olympics. It also means that we have a paradigm shift from 30 years where price was key to a new situation where security is key. And security also, of course, means energy, which is closely related to the subject you are discussing today. But it's not only China, it's also Ukraine. This debate is taking place behind the background of an imminent threat of war in Ukraine, and again that would have huge consequences for energy delivered towards Europe, and the debate about Nord Stream 2 is currently already ongoing. So every crisis we have been seeing over the last 10 years or so has only reinforced the conviction that we need a stronger European Union. And every crisis has brought a stronger European Union. Health, among all issues, was considered until very recently to be firmly and only in the national sphere. But the moment it is becoming clear that the nation state is overburdened, it is happily moved over to the European Union. So the European Union at any moment has to show that it's able to deal with this. The green transition is a typical example. Nobody, no state on its own can successfully address it. We will need to have carbon pricing, and that means that we will also need to defend our economic and industrial interests towards third countries. So green transition has to happen in an unfavorable framework of increasing international tensions, both with China and with Russia, and therefore will need a lot of stamina. I would like to wish your conference good success.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, dear Klaus. You are, as Secretary General, the continuity in the European Parliament. Normally, the presidents are in office always for 2.5 years, but you are in office already for 12 years, and I wish you a long time to come, because we very much appreciate your great responsibility, your service to the European Parliament. So thank you very much for your opening remarks, and I can inform you that yesterday the reflection group of the former Members Association that deals with the conference on the future of Europe adopted 10 points, a paper which will be our contribution to the conference on the future of Europe. And this paper goes today to the board of the former Members Association, and I hope that they will agree. And I think the substance is quite good, and so the former members of the European Parliament can still make a contribution for the future of the European Union. So all the best, Klaus, for you personally and your work. And now it's a pleasure to hand over to Brian Maguire, so he has to work now. Brian, please.
Thanks, Hans-Gert. It could have been you. Klaus Welle, thank you so much for an excellent opening contribution, and the clarity of the remarks about the challenges that we face, but also the heritage which we have been given, and the challenge of what we need to do next with that. So we're going to hear a lot of different dimensions, developing some of the themes that Klaus Welle has set out as well, particularly to do with the climate challenge, and to be seen in the context of opportunity, not just in terms of a desperate situation in need of a remedy as well. So our first speaker this morning is Cristina Gallach-Figueras. She's the former Spanish government's High Commissioner for the 2030 Agenda, responsible for coordinating the country's implementation of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, former Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and Ibero-America and the Caribbean, and also a journalist as well. Great to have you with us today. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Brian, for the presentation, and thanks very much to President Pöttering, former President Pöttering, for this invitation that brings me back to Brussels, although virtually, but I am physically in Brussels. I had already decided to come when I got the invitation to be here with you, although we cannot be together in the same room. And it's true, for a number of years now I'm settled in Madrid, but trying to join this conference with the view of how do we see from Mediterranean countries, Southern Mediterranean countries, the Green New Deal is for me a true honor. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to make 6 basic points in order to set what I think is the essence of the Green New Deal. First of all, it is a political plan. We are not talking about an environmental process. We are not talking about an issue which is only related to climate. In fact, we have in front of us the possibility of a profound transformation of our societies. And I like very much what President of the Commission von der Leyen said when she referred to the Green New Deal as the man on the moon moment, because it has such an energy for transformation that touches all aspects of our society. Second thing, it is for me very important that in this political plan, the EU has the opportunity to become the leader. And I think it is so obvious that for a number of reasons we have been behind. Our population is shrinking. We have powers in the world that are raising in terms of their military, but also political. In fact, we've seen progress, economic progress in many corners, and this has reduced the space and the influence of the European Union. I think that this is a tremendous opportunity to lead, and for me, I'm going to develop this point further. In the depth of the political transformation, for me is also very important because it represents an intergenerational social contract for the Europeans. This is very important in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals that Brian mentioned. I was in charge of implementing in Spain. At the very center of this agenda is what are we going to leave to the future generations, and how are we going to leave behind our planet. So a political plan that has this potential for leadership, and that has this intrinsic intragenerational and intergenerational basis is for me fantastic. I was working at the United Nations as Under Secretary General when the SDGs, the 2030 Agenda was adopted. And the European Union was extremely involved in shaping the agenda. But it got us in a moment of a complex socioeconomical issues, in particularly in the aftermath of the crisis, etc. So the perspective that the Europeans took of the agenda was mainly to dedicate the efforts to help the other countries to develop. The fact that we have adopted the Green New Deal is transformative in the sense that we are not only as Europeans going to support the development of countries that need it more, but also that countries ourselves, our own socio-economic structures. Let me mention another point which I think it is fundamental, is that we are decoupling the economic growth from the use of resources, which we see it every year clearly with the Overshot Day Now it is this year was in July. So I think this is clear of how we are changing our paradigm, and I think also it's a good point now to mention here the role of Europe in the climate conferences, in particularly in COP26, where we were among the leading countries in maintaining the engagements and in building the rule book that is so necessary to implement the Paris Climate Agreement. Let me make another point now, the second point, which is the impact of the pandemic in the Green New Deal. It's fundamental. We were expected to roll out the Green New Deal in a non-pandemic environment, and our plans have been totally shaken. But I will bring here a challenge, which is the challenge of making the pandemic an opportunity. This is often said, very difficult to refer and to act. But for me, the fact that we are going to be able to mobilize up to 1 trillion euros to implement the Green New Deal. And at the same time, we are going to be mobilizing the recovery funds, the next generation funds that will be mainly for the countries that have been more suffering the impact of the pandemic. I think this is a convergence of possibilities, which brings to my mind an opportunity to transform this tremendous impact of the pandemic in something more positive. There is another additional issue, which is technology, which is science. The upsurge of the role of science that we have been seeing in order to combat the pandemic with the vaccines, etc. I think it gives us more confidence in the transformation of the pandemic as an opportunity. It is true, the ugly side of globalization, which we had already seen, is now more obvious, and some countries and regions that were able to climb up the ladder, graduate from LDCs, etc., are falling back. And here, this adds additional responsibility for the Europeans as engines for those that are being more impacted by the pandemic. For me, it's critical in this transformation of the pandemic as an opportunity is our ability to learn to live with COVID. The desperation of one steam coming after the other and confusing our citizens on when this is going to be left behind is clear. Our economic recovery is not as it was expected as a V. It is much more complex, much more slow. We are, for example, seeing in Spain, our economic plans are not being fulfilled as we thought. Therefore, there is a tremendous sense of insecurity despite of the plans that we have seen for the recovery from the pandemic. Let me mention another point, which is the geopolitics of the Green New Deal. It is true, the current geopolitical situation is extremely complex, fragile. We are all seeing confrontations across the world, but the fact that we have an instrument and we have a plan, which is the implementation of our vision, there is no doubt that will reinforce the role of the European Union and the leadership role of the European Union. We lead in climate, we can lead in equality and inclusion, and we can lead also in food systems. So those are areas which are linked to the Green New Deal, bring an opportunity for the European Union to shape a geopolitical world. Major challenges, yes, Klaus Welle mentioned them: China, US-China confrontation, US-Russia confrontation, which can become EU-China confrontation and EU-Russia confrontation. But I think we have some very interesting instruments like the strategic compass, which will help us guide these challenges and truly reinforce this transformation of the geopolitics that the Green New Deal will bring. The relevance of the fossil fuel economies is definitely expected to decrease. And I think this will have an impact in many regions in the world, the Gulf region, some of the countries that benefited from transit of energies will have to look for other resources. And I think this can only be good, because these asymmetries that we have seen in the last period, in the last years, that fossil fuel have been leading our economic developments, really can make a U-turn and change. Let me mention now the shocks that are appearing in the process, which need to be addressed. Energy challenges we have seen in the last period of time, extremely disruptive energy prices, the burden of these challenges on the most vulnerable, and this links into the ethical aspects of the Green New Deal, which have to be at the center of our plan. The rupture of the global change, which is more related to the COVID-19.
Christina, I can't hear you. I think you've accidentally hit the mute button there.
Yes. And one for me very important that we have to be prepared is for the shaping of the taxonomy. Shaping of the taxonomy probably as a result of these shocks that we are seeing, that will provoke a necessary deal, or not so necessary deal, but probably a deal in between maintaining support for nuclear as for gas in the transitional period. I would like to refer briefly to the moral and ethical issues and the cost of inaction. Such a transformative plan has to be extremely profound moral and ethical pillars. We have seen one of the mottos of the SDGs is "Leave no one behind," and this ought to be at the center of our policies. Solidarity. We should not plan for a transition that doesn't think about the impact on the others, and we see this clearly when people demonstrate as a reflex of the anger, but also the preoccupations, the worries, and the insatisfactions of the current situation. Just transition is fundamental for the Green New Deal. My one before last point is who is in the lead. Definitely, and this is also a result of the pandemic, there has been a reinforcement of the public sector, public service. One of the consequences, we saw the role of the administrations and the public sector as decisive in the last period of time, but we are not going to be able to succeed in this Green New Deal without public-private partnerships, considering the dimension of the efforts that are needed and that must be mobilized. I would like to bring here the name of one of the key private sector leaders on sustainability. Probably you all know well, the former CEO of Unilever, Paul Polman, who is assuming a lot of responsibility, mobilizing CEOs across the world in order to play this role of catalyzers of engagement between with the public sector, and he tells a lot in his last book, Net Positive, how companies thrive by giving more than they take. So as a wrap up, probably we have not seen such a feel-good moment to be European for decades as we see now. I remember during the crisis in 2010, 11, in some of the trips I was doing across the world, in the image of the EU in shock after in particular in some countries, and the image of EU in disunity were tremendous. Now I think we have a totally different paradigm in front of us, and I think that has major potential. Still many challenges, the denials, the illiberal policies, the populisms. I think this is very much linked to the ethical aspects of the plan and the complex geopolitical processes. The complexity as well of the legislative packages that we have at the table, which bring confrontations, discussions, and probably in some moments disunity amongst our member states. But definitely this is such a formative and shaping moment that I think it is energizes all of us. And as a conclusion, I was looking for something positive, because I know that we will be bringing during the debate many negative or complex aspects. And I found something which is for me extraordinary, which is the contributions that a lady, Jane Goodall, who I happened to meet at the United Nations, she is one of the UN messengers of peace, is doing through her hopecasts. She brings to the waves, in particularly to the young people, pieces of debate with vision of hopefulness. And I think the fact that such a personality, which is so influenced, had such a great influence among the young people. I've seen her acting in the United Nations and dedicating to the current world in such a complex, living such complex moments. The Hopecast is very good. No doubt, the Green New Deal is the Hopecast for the European Union and for all of us. Thank you very much.
Christina, thank you. You know, it's exceptional to hear someone speak so positively and with such continuity, and to see the thread of opportunity through all these dimensions as well. I think that's a welcome perspective, given how much we're constantly challenged by the negative and potentially overwhelming situations that we find ourselves. So let's continue with that sensibility as well, and we'll hear more about what's possible during these discussions as well. Stay with us. We're going to hear our next speaker. Then we'll bring some questions to you. Just to say to our audience, if you haven't worked it out by now, there is French and English translation on there. You can see in the chat section just how you can do that. Click on the interpretation button and choose the language you would like to hear. And also just to remind you, please send your questions in as well. We're going to bring some questions to Christina and our next speaker, Justin Beck, in a few minutes as well. And then we'll move on to other panels as well. So let me introduce our next speaker, a very distinguished guest. I've had the pleasure to speak with numerous times before, Professor Jos-Marie Delbecq. He's School of Transnational Governance part-time professor and a full professor of KU Leuven in Belgium. He's the European University first European Investment Bank Chair on the Climate Change Policy and International Carbon Markets. And those are some of the themes that Brussels bubblers will be most familiar with him as well. So we're delighted to have Jos with us today. Jos, the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you, Brian, and it is really my pleasure to be with you all today. And my comments are going to be very much complementary to what Mr. Welle and Mrs. Gallach just made as key points. And so I prepared some slides because if we could see them, I would like to focus the debate on climate change, and I would like to bring forward a number of basic facts within which we are playing today. And on the next slide, I will take you through a number of scientific points towards the global
I think you, okay, can we hear you there?
There is something going wrong. Could I have the next slide, please? Yes, so that's what I would like to do, go from the science into the global context. That was very much in the core of what has been said today, and moving from there to the Green Deal and the Fit for 55 package that is currently on the table. And on the next slide, let's start with the science. The science about climate change has never been so clear and so thoroughly discussed and analyzed. Thousands of researchers are united in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they made lots of pages, thousands of pages, which I would like to summarize in perhaps not more than 3 points. What we are currently seeing is unprecedented, not just in terms of decades, but also in terms of millennia. It is the human influence on the climate that is so clear, which means fossil fuel use. And all regions of the globe are impacted, and I think it goes very much into the issues that were raised by Mr. Welle and Mrs. Gallach. We normally talk about sea level rise, but it is much more beyond an ecological impact. It's geopolitical in nature. Look at what is going on in the Arctic, or what is going on in the Mediterranean, and the migration waves we are seeing, just as a few elements that climate change is really reinforcing. And on the next slide, I think what is being said is what is happening. Next slide, yes, thank you. We see that in terms of the geological cycle we are in, it is really spectacular what we are going through. What we are going through over the last 100 years is the little red at the bottom or at the right-hand side of the graph. This is the global warming over the last 100 years. And what it basically says is that if we put ourselves in the geological cycle of the Holocene, what we are seeing is breaking old trends. We are covering new territory, and people are saying we are moving into the Anthropocene, but we don't know what the boundaries are of this new geological period. And so what we are currently seeing, scientists are united, is not just unique, it is spectacular, and it is worrying, and we should better control the boundaries of what is currently happening. Now, on the next slide, please, things are not moving well. Look at the CO2 emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution. It goes up and up and up, and there is no peak we have reached, and we are not yet reducing the emissions. And that is a very disappointing figure. In fact, you could see roughly on the slide that we were about to level off the increase in CO2 emissions around the 1980s. But then came an additional part, which is the red zone of the graph, which is the emissions related to the new emerging economies. And we see China there as a major player, but we see also other emerging economies. And, you know, this new wave of industrialization in the world has changed the climate change picture totally, because we were, until the 1990s, the years 2000, under the Kyoto Protocol, but that was no longer fit for purpose. And so we needed to go further. We needed to go into the Paris Agreement. And on the next slide is another brutal reality, that is that the largest emitters today are China, the US, and India and the EU. The differences are quite big, and that explains a little bit of the finger pointing that is currently happening towards China. We saw, and towards India, we saw the COP26, but it begs some more questions. And I wanted to complement this picture of the largest emitters today with two additional pictures that should bring us to more thoughtful comments than just finger pointing to the new and emerging economies. And on the next slide, we see that per head, the emissions in, for example, China or in India are much lower than what they are, for example, in the United States. I have no graph for the EU 27, but we are close to Germany, you know, that is really at the average of the EU. But you could say that the European and the Chinese emissions today per head are half of what they are in the United States. And if we look at China, if we look further than China towards India, you see that the emissions per head are pretty low. They are almost a quarter or a fifth of what they are, for example, in the United States. And if we move further down to the United States, to countries like Canada and the Gulf countries, we have even higher emissions per capita. Now, let's move to the next slide, indeed, where another, you know, element is very important, and that is the question: who has contributed the most to global CO2 emissions when we take a historical perspective? And there you see that the United States and the EU 28, or let's say the Western industrialized nations, have been emitting since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution approximately 60 to 70% of current emissions that are hanging in the atmosphere. And that the share of China is important, but much less. And the share of India, knowing that they are such a populous continent, is much, much less. So that gives the contours of a very complicated discussion like we have been seeing in COP26. You know, where are you, biggest polluter? China. China saying, where are you, wealthy country, United States, with one of the highest emissions per capita? And the developing world saying, where are you, rich West, because you are at the source of the problem. And so that makes a very complicated game when we come in terms of equity effort, or when we raise the issue of having a fair transition or a socially just transition, not only inside into our community, but also in the world at large. And on the next slide, you know, let's look at what came out of the COP26. We have been seeing, and that is the result after all. We know there, as in every COP, there are always things going well and less well and all the rest of it. But what stands up, that is that a number of very important emitters have put policy plans on the table for 2050. And this led to a strengthening of the targets compared to where we were in Paris and where we are now after Glasgow, after COP26. In fact, we can say that we moved from a world that we're heading towards 3 degrees Celsius warming. We are now close to a world where we are about 2 degrees Celsius warming. Of course, there are optimists like the IEA who claims we are already at the 1.8. There are pessimists saying, but we have not yet seen the implementation of those targets, so wait and see. We are rather at 2.4. But I think what is really standing up after Glasgow, that we have seen a strengthening of the targets that is meaningful, because 1 degree Celsius by the mid of the century makes a hell of a lot of difference for the result of climate change. Now, we are not yet there, and next year there is going to be another COP. As every year there is a COP that is going to be in Egypt, and there is going to be a checking whether all these pledges and all these targets, are they the subject of real policies? And that is really what matters. And we are going to go in a minute into the policies of the EU, but finalizing these comments on the international side, on the next slide, I wanted to summarize where we are with our international strategy by the EU when it comes to climate change. And it starts from the fact that today's climate change that we are observing, and we observe it already in the Arctic or in the Mediterranean, or the flooding that we have been seeing in Central Europe these last months, that this climate change is caused by us. But what is more worrying is that the climate change of the future generations is going to be primarily caused by the emerging economies. And so it is so important that we have a multilateral approach in which all countries come together. And that is the importance of the Paris Agreement. We had them together in Rio de Janeiro when we did the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We had the Kyoto Protocol, but given with the degree the world has changed, the Kyoto Protocol only covered at the end 12% of global emissions. Now the Paris Agreement covers all of them. And so that is important, that Europe has been a driver to incorporate all countries, you know, rich and poor, and in all stages of economic development, and everybody has to do what it can do reasonably within the possibilities of the economic and the political and the endowment by nature, the conditions of every country. And so Europe in all this sees itself de facto as a laboratory for low carbon technology and low carbon policies. And that has been inspired by the fact that Europe is responsible historically for the climate change that we are currently seeing. But we also came to the realization that turning around the ship of economic development may create a lot of economic opportunities. And I think that's the spirit within which the Green Deal in Europe took shape. We are responsible. We have to act first. This will have a temporary cost, but in the long term, there may be economic opportunities. And I think that is de facto what we see emerging as Europe's international climate strategy. So let's then on the next slide zoom in on where we are today on the Green Deal. The Green Deal is a very ambitious policy program. It aims for a 55% reduction by 2030 based on 1990. Today we are roughly at 24-25%. So we are not even yet halfway. And that is very important to realize how ambitious this 55% reduction is. And it represents a huge investment challenge, because we will need additional investments in all sectors of the economy, but in particular in the field of energy, in the field of transport, in the field of construction, where our houses must be made much more energy efficient compared to what we have been seeing in the past, and in industry, where low carbon innovation is already taking shape, but not yet at the scale of what we need. So the European Green Deal is a comprehensive policy package, and it is ambitious, but it points at an enormous amount of additional investments that have to be made already as of now, because given the cycle of things and the magnitude of the challenge, 2030 is the day after tomorrow. And so we must really hurry up. Now, on the next slide, it takes up the comment that was made by Mrs. Gallach, on which I totally agree. The EU budget and the Next Generation EU, the post-COVID recovery fund, is providing a lot of money. that could be used for the green dimension. Roughly more than a third of this 1.8 billion can be used for financing and encouraging the green dimension. And so that's a very important help. Moving towards, next slide, to what's really climate policy instruments are that we have in Europe. We have a multitude of them. Some are working very well, some are working, more or less well. Some are being a subject of review. But basically, we could say we have three sorts of climate policy instruments. We have the market-based ones. We have put a price on carbon, the ETS. We are also asking private companies and banks to be much more open about the disclosure of the information related to climate and sustainability. And apart from that, we have a lot of mandatory standards and benchmarks. We are regulating our cars, for example, or the use of fluorinated gases. We are encouraging energy efficiency and putting, standards on the member states on how to speed up the process. And of course, we have the renewable energy that is really a fantastic achievement if we see it from where we started 20 years ago and where we are today. And the third element is governance. We need member states, to trace very good where they are having success and also where they have to encourage, the policies. So governance systems are also very important. For the sake of brevity, I will zoom in on three specific instruments. On the next slide, I zoom in on the carbon market that we are currently having today. We have today, quite high prices on that carbon market. Yesterday, the 80 euros per ton of carbon dioxide was crossed for the second day. So that is really important. It is a real driver for companies to reduce their emissions. But on the next slide, on the legislative talks, we have two major challenges coming our way. And I think they were mentioned by the previous speakers, which is the carbon leakage and the competitiveness of Europe's industry, where a whole debate is now unfolding about a border tariff that we may need to encourage the innovation wave that we are currently having, to encourage these investments in the low carbon products of the future. Steel, cement, chemicals, they must be made low carbon. And so a carbon border adjustment mechanism, competitiveness matters, and inviting others to join forces in the climate effort. And the other element is the social impact. I think that Mrs. Gallagher was very clear in saying we have something at hand today, high energy prices, and on top of that comes the Green Deal that is not going per se reduce the energy prices unless we have a social policy related to that. And so there is now talk and a proposal by the Commission on the creation of a social climate fund to address fuel poverty. And I think that's a very new development that is very welcome. And it is a undebatable part of the Green Deal that the competitiveness of European industry, the jobs, in industry have to be maintained and safeguarded. And at the same time, we have to address the social impact in particular of those falling into the fuel poverty trap. So that's related to the ETS. And on the next slide, I think we can have our heads up on renewable energy, how good we have been so far in Europe. Of course, much more needs to be done. We have crossed today the 20% of final energy consumption, and we have to move to 40% by 2030, which is another doubling, which is going to be challenging. But the costs related to renewable energy have gone down spectacularly, so that we see that the market is taking it over, that solar panels, the windmills in particular in the sea are going down in costs, and that is really an encouraging sign. So renewable energy, we must do much more, and the market is picking up on that. And on the next slide, the third measure I would like to bring to your attention is the one related to sustainable finance. The taxonomy regulation was mentioned. I think what is green and what is not green is very important. Greenwashing is a disease that we have to fight, because greenwashing undermines the trust of the population that is being told that whatever they do is going to be green in the long term. No, it's not. So we need a good classification of what is green, what is more or less green, and what is not at all green. I think that is where we are going. And the financial companies have now the obligation, as of next year, maybe postponed to the year after, let's see how it is going, to disclose their information about what they are doing on climate and sustainable issues. And that is for all financial companies a mandatory disclosure obligation that is already there. And all major companies are following after that with the Corporate Social Reporting Directive that is currently being discussed between the institutions. And let's hope that we have an equally ambitious outcome compared to the sustainable finance disclosure. So I have used up my time, I'm afraid. So I come to the last slide, which I try to summarize what are the challenges that I see for the green transition in the EU. The first is the EU is seeing itself as a global laboratory for climate-friendly policies and technologies because it's responsible and it may have an opportunity. It must have an opportunity in the future for all of us. The second point is that the climate ambition of 55% and the climate neutrality by 2050, which is the in-between step, is really ambitious, but it is possible, provided we strengthen our policies to do that. And that's the third point. The Green Deal is a massive investment program. And it is so massively an investment program that it allows to address the social concerns, the job concerns, as much as the concerns in terms of the new investments that are needed in low carbon innovation and low carbon commodities. The fourth conclusion that I'm taking is that the market-based approach has been delivering the most part of the emission reduction so far and is expected to deliver the half of the ambitious emission reduction that is foreseen for 2030. And finally, energy is key. We talked about renewables, but saving energy, energy efficiency, and use less fossil fuels is, of course, what it is all about. Otherwise, we are nowhere going to be close to the 55% reduction by 2030. So I would like to leave it there, Brian, and hand over the microphone to you again.
Josh, thanks so much. I know you're under some time pressure now as well, so we'll keep this short. Just a couple of follow-up questions for you and for Christina as well. Let me try to tie together some elements of what you both highlighted. In particular, the market-based and the corporate side of this as well. You tackled some different sides. Christina was talking about the benefit to the company of taking a social approach as well, and Josh is talking about the substantial investment, but the return that we see in the marketplace for climate action coming from the market-driven factors as well. I find that interesting when we put that together in the context of leadership and the 1 billion. And the Next Generation Europe, this funding that is there, it seems to me this is seed money if you were to talk about startups, and that we're talking about climate startup at this stage. We're going to have a COP every year. We're going to have this constant renewal of direction as well. And as Klaus said at the beginning, we're talking about different dimensions of time, past, present, and future. So what I want to ask you is, in terms of this leadership, clearly you're positive of what can be done. What are the obstacles to getting it done? What does the European Union need to focus on to smooth the path, or do we simply have to accept that this is a slow burn approach? We will burn slowly if we don't hurry up with this as well. So how do you see this in terms of leadership directly? Christina?
For me, a key issue is to ensure that our private sector leaders, CEOs, and the shareholders do enter into a mindset change process, short-term versus long-term. If a company needs to present to the shareholders results with a short-term premise of benefits, this company is going to be extremely limited in investing in the transformations that are required. So short-termism for me is a disease. And the best way to combat that is to strengthen the CEOs, the leadership, our politicians and our leaders, society regions, leaders, to really phase out this short-termism. Because what is at stake is so huge, so tremendously necessary, profound in nature, and beneficiary worldwide, that we cannot be slaves of short-termism.
Thank you, Christina. I want to spend another hour just talking about the finance of that and how you get that done. We don't have the time. Just for you as well, and the leadership here as well, what needs done?
Well, I would agree with Christina. I think in companies and in the financial sector, the penny is dropping. And I think people are seeing this holds opportunities for the future. And I see in the steel sector, in the chemical sector, in the cement sector, these hard to abate sectors, that the mines are moving very fast. Where I'm more worried is about many local authorities where there is a huge challenge related, for example, the renovation of existing buildings. Building codes need to be changed. Insulation efforts have to go up. The heat pumps must take place and must be installed. These technologies are there, but local politics is not as suited as it is for leading towards the targets that have been agreed in Europe. And so I think we need a better translation mechanism towards this local regional authorities. Again, European funds could help a lot. The regional funds are there. I think also what is being done on the COVID recovery fund is very helpful because it's based on plans, and plans are being screened. Are they green enough? And I think that is helpful. And that is also offering a wake-up call. So I would add to the leadership that we are already seeing in the private sector, the ones that we may see from politicians, sometimes at the local and regional level.
Thank you. Just before you go, one short response to the lessons learned from COVID in the context of climate as well. Christina, what do you think is going to be translated from the COVID experience into the climate action?
Well, I have a fear. I have a fear that COVID has been so disruptive and has basically pulled backwards in many societies, both in Europe and far away, that we will need extra stamina. We will need further doses of leadership to bring things to the rail. And I think the fear can be compensated by this tremendously generous package of new generation funds, etc. I think that's a compensation. We will need a lot of leadership engagement and a lot of communication. We see the movements, for example, on the anti-vaccines. All these are signals of a fatigue, and I think those are the things to combat more.
Thank you, Christina. Last word, Jost, before you run off.
Well, I would agree. Let's fight polarization in our society, and let's base more and point people towards the facts. And the facts are that renewable energy, electricity, is today very cheap. The facts are that an electric vehicle is very cheap. The fact is that using public transport is very cheap and brings the climate effort. So if we talk more pragmatic towards households, and if we address the social impacts, because that's a very important one. You cannot renovate your house if you are very poor, because you may live in a social housing project type of building, and there public authorities have to step in. So the social factor matches with the pragmatic factor, and let's get away from polarization. That is what I would answer to your question.
Thank you. In the end, all politics is local. Jost, Christina, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it. Christina, if you can stay around, we'll have more to talk about later. Jost, take care. We'll speak to you again soon. Let's move on to our next panel. And this topic is a green and sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. I'll build out on what we just talked about there. Our speakers for this session are Eva Patriskova. She's EPP Senior Political Advisor and advisor focusing on the EU's environmental, energy and agriculture policies. And Dasha Sazic-Silovic. She's the president of the European Partners for the Environment and chair of the international board, the CE Network for Gender Issues as well. Great to have both of you with us today. Just a short introductory comments from both of you, and then we'll talk more detail about this issue as well. So Eva, you want to kick off?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very happy to contribute to this interesting debate. So good morning to everybody. I would actually, in my introductory remarks, like to follow up on the concluding remarks of the previous speakers. You discussed the parallels between the climate crisis and the COVID crisis, and what can we learn from this, and how can we implement it further. I also have been thinking about this. What do we learn, and how the two are similar. Even in Jos Delbecque's presentation, he mentioned that the climate change is now unprecedented. It's resulting from human activity, and all regions are impacted. He might as well have been talking about COVID. So we indeed see and we're able to see the impacts of human activity on the environment. It's still, let's say, debated what was the virus, how did it emerge and spread, but there is some interference, for example, with humans interfering with nature in the wet markets in Asia. So this is certainly a cause for concern. And then during the lockdowns, we could also very quickly see what happens when the human activity ceases and how the nature readapts itself. And is basically reborn. So this was very clear. We also could see the importance of nature for humans. When people were locked down, they longed for nature, for green parks, at least to have a walk in during the day, to go into nature, which would give them a sense of peace and calm. So this was also important, and I think it increased a bit of awareness among the population on the importance of the environment and to protect the environment. So this is, I think, important lesson. We also learned that we have to trust the science, the data, verified information. We have seen a lot of spread of false information and fake news. So as policymakers and politicians, I think this is important when we now think about combating climate change. We also have seen, I think, very clearly that populists don't have the right answers. They don't have the courage to take responsibility and make the difficult decisions. So it's mostly let's say, the more conscious and responsible policymakers and the more, I would say, traditional parties that are willing to do these difficult steps. And I think we can count on them also in terms of fighting climate change. We have seen the power of collective action. So the importance of each individual, but also everybody to come on board and do something. So either fighting COVID or fighting climate change. And we have also seen the importance of solidarity. So in the COVID crisis, it was the solidarity with the older generation. In climate change, we need to have some solidarity with the next generations and the way we leave our planet to them. Also in terms of member states, the poorer or richer member states, and having this joint procurement for the vaccine, it showed us the relevance of being, let's say, cooperating among each other, but also solidarity with the developing world. The EU has been the biggest donor in terms of donating vaccines to the developing countries. And in climate change, it's also important to have solidarity with for example, with the island nations and the most exposed countries. We have also seen some pitfalls of EU coordination. It was difficult at the start, at least, to coordinate the different policies. I think this is important in the upcoming or current Future of Europe debate. This panel is part of the series of the Future of Europe contribution. So I think this is important to learn from this crisis and how it can be improved for the next ones. And I think, just to conclude my intervention and introduction, we have also, I think, seen the ability of humans, and it was mentioned also by the previous speakers, the ability to adapt, to quickly change our ways of doing things. Even this conference was supposed to be in person, and then it was quickly changed to take place online. And I think this is a great let's say, achievement of and the opportunity that we have gained from this past experience. So I think this is also something we can take with us forward. But I will be happy to discuss it further in this panel. And thank you again for having me.
Eva, thank you so much. Dasha, over to you.
Well, thank you very much first for inviting me, and thank you very much, Brian, for the introduction. If I were to close my eyes, I would see this as that vital moment in our European, I would say, post-World War II history. We've had the social welfare state and the whole plan after 1945. We experienced the end of the Cold War, 89, 90, and we have a lot of lessons to learn from these two periods. And now we are in a third phase, in a phase where we have to learn from those lessons, build on some of them, and at the same time assume, I think, an important role in addressing our own European, but also global challenges. And it's a very, very tall order, because when we look at this whole package, actually, it's a package. It's a package of strategy and tools, and it's a package of our, I would say, civilizational response. Because it's not only about the tools that we're going to use, it's about the vision that we want to have for Europe in the next many years. Meaning that the conference on the future of Europe is as important as I would say the strategy in setting the framework of the democratic development and participatory and solidarity framework for our future, in order to be able to implement this tall order. In that sense, and thank you very much for all the speakers, because I had some prepared points, and then when I listened to you, my mind went absolutely haywire. I think the first issue, if you were to graphically portray this moment, you would have a vertical, and that vertical would be the European level, the regional level, the national, the local level. Then you will have a transversal, which is a horizontal line looking at the topics, at the issues that we have to tackle with a cross-cutting participatory and democracy element. My colleague previously was talking about the COVID response. There are quite a few fallouts of that we may want to address in trying to implement the Green Deal, and looking at the just transition. We belong, my organizations belong to the European Alliance for a Just Transition, formed by Solidar and partners just recently, and also to the Inclusiveness Initiative of Paul Francis with the private sector. And when I look at that, the question of inequalities, and the previous speakers mentioned it, is a huge issue for us. We've come into a situation where in Europe we are seeing poverty. And now if looking at it from Southern Europe and looking at it particularly from the Western Balkans, 25% of people live under the poverty line. We are talking about the digital revolution, and it is really a number of those revolutions whereby the digital doesn't really touch big swaths of our population. So how the heck are you going to do it? And so looking at the inclusiveness side of it, you're also looking at gender equality. And I must say to my colleague Galak, because I've been working at the back end, actually, all the reports on the MDGs, the SDGs, and so on at the UN. The question for us is, well, why haven't we, and I think Brian, you raised the question of the barriers. Why haven't we got there after all this time? Which raises that issue of also monitoring, but I'll just say a couple of things after that. So the issue for us is how can we manage all those issues or topics or in goals in a priority framework? And then how can we make that I would say civilizational jump into the way we are going to do business in the future. And this relates to democracy. When I say doing business, I am now looking at the democratic deficits that we are seeing in our Europe. And in coming from the Western Balkans, where there is a lot of criticism on the complacency and the inaction in a way towards a non-democratic or autocratic, populist tendencies and regimes that are cropping up. So, you know, we'll have a big toss in being able to get that democracy deficit addressed and being able to bring our population with us, which raises the question of, and I think it came in a way, of the buy-in by our population. Because some of the perceptions in the public are that this is an elitist agenda. And so how do we actually get the buy-in for its implementation? And in a way, I may disagree with Professor Delbecq in the sense that looking at it from an aerial view, you will see that the local level is sometimes much more conducive because of all the governance issues that we have in our countries to the green economy. And now I'm now looking at the Croatian level. Paradoxically or fortunately or unfortunately, we are having a paradox of subsistence farming being more green than the industrial farming. And so when people are poor, basically they don't have the fertilizers and so on. And you know, we were not mentioning the farm to fork. I think Ms. Galak did mention the food issue, but sitting here in Geneva, the papers are now full of saying, well, we'll have shortages by the end of this for Christmas. So what does that mean? It's not only the supply chains, it's also the urea, the lack of urea production and the supply chains and so on. So we have a huge problem on our hands, and it will be the question of leadership, as Brian was asking, on how we'll be able to, you know, pull ourselves together in a crisis which has exacerbated by the COVID crisis. We're talking about the recovery funds. I'm very sorry, but we have to monitor the transparency of spending of recovery funds. Who is making the decisions, the strategic decisions where these funds are going to go, and who is going to monitor? I will not name the countries, but we have seen serious fallouts of the transparency on the use of funds and the corruption that has ensued. And that is a democracy. This is the issue of democracy. This is the issue of transparency, and this issue is the monitoring. Finally, two things. It's very interesting that the latest discussions on the anti-vax movement are unearthing the causes much deeper than what we say, okay, this is a lack of understanding, this is, I don't know, the populists are using the movements, etc., etc. We're seeing that it is directly linked to, and I'm now talking about sociologists talking and epidemiologists talking and so on, the direct link to the lack of public trust, which has risen from the fact that we have been shifting the responsibilities of the health system to the private sector without accountability on both sides. And so people are not trusting the systems. They're not trusting public institutions. And if we want to get the Green Deal, and this is, I would say, a positive stimulation for us, is how to be able to bring that social cohesion, make that social contract that will be an incentive for us to implement the strategy. And I think people are ready overall. We also need to prepare people for the hardships that are going to come, whether it's the energy crisis, whether it's the food crisis that's or whether it's the employment issue. We talked about employment, but we didn't talk about the new skills. We talk about the digital. What new skills and labor policies, labor laws do we need to put in place? And many countries are trying to do it. And we are saying, hold on for a minute. We are still not there. We still have to see the effects of this whole situation in order to get a law passed. Because if we pass it now, it will be very difficult to change tomorrow. And then are we going to throw the inclusiveness and the social contract issue out with the bathwater? So very tall order in an extremely, and thank you very much for all those who've spoken about it, difficult international geopolitical environment, where looking at it from the Western Balkan perspective, we are seriously worried because some of that is playing out in an already raw political situation. And we are seeing a potential of new tension. I wouldn't call it a conflict, but hopefully. But we are very, very worried. So looking at it this way, I think that democratic deficit needs to be addressed in order for us to be able to go forward and build a democratic framework that will be there. The positive is Generation Z is there. Forget the millennials. The Generation Z is there. You sit on a New York bus and you will hear little kids talking about the environment and climate change and how they are green because their parents are not having cars anymore. So the good thing is, and much is happening at local level that we are unable to grasp. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I'm too long.
No, but super interesting.
I'm looking forward to the question.
Excellent. Okay, I want to maybe pitch this in a slightly different way. And I want to focus on the word sustainable recovery from the title of this as well. And to talk about the sustainability in context of democracy, as you've highlighted, Dasha, and perceptions as Eva has laid out in terms of how we perceive things differently now as well. Now, I'm living in Washington. I'm in Brussels today, but living in Washington. And the worst cliches about American society and the division and the democratic process that we have as Europeans in general, I find to be worse when you're living there as well. The division in society that translates into the inability to drive legislation in a way which is can be sustained over the medium term, never mind the long term as well. I have a concern that we will face the same disruption in Europe as well, for many of the reasons you've just laid out as well, Dasha, as well. And so if we're to have a sustainable recovery, if we're to have a green future, and if we're to lead in this as well, how do we rebuild that trust that you've described as well? How do we ensure that accountability, the democratic deficit or perceived democratic deficit is removed as well? So Eva, you talked about how people's perceptions may have changed during COVID crisis as well. How do we convince people that the green recovery is in their best interests, and this is not an elitist approach, but a necessary reorganization of our society?
Thank you, Brian. Indeed, this is I think maybe the biggest challenge, but we have the opportunity to build on the momentum we have gained, I think, during the pandemic. And indeed, for this fundamental transformation to succeed, it has to be a citizen driven. It has to come from the citizens. Everybody has to be on board. There are those that will be disadvantaged, and for them we have to have the right mechanisms in place.
Well, let me ask you this then. How do you get the citizens on board when they don't trust government, they don't trust authority, their information sources are increasingly through WhatsApp groups, through other forms of easily manipulated disinformation, and that marvelous universe that is Facebook, which we all love and are addicted to but can't leave despite what we know goes on. How do you make that happen?
Well, for example, the role of the local governments was mentioned. I think they certainly play a role. Maybe the level of trust is higher when you see a familiar face. Also, the role of, I mean, each individual on its own. Yes, you mentioned the social media, but still, I think when I see different statistics and the way that what sort of information sources people trust is often their families. So even if just talking within the family and spreading information through the various generations can help, then every citizen can have a role in this. And if we get the communities organized and starting it really from the bottom-up approach, I think this is the only way that the citizens can at least come to touch with this issue and have some notion of it.
Dasha, do you think these issues have become so complex that people are not just suffering from fatigue, but a kind of confusion where they can't find their way through to the facts? So, governments, experts can present the facts time and time again, and yet that level of fatigue, either people withdraw from the discussion or they simply go to the easiest channel to follow, which could well be fear-driven and based on disinformation. Is it possible to drive this narrative any longer?
There are two. There's the bad news and good news. The bad news is that lack of trust in government, and the reason for that, frankly, is in the region, particularly where I work, the question of corruption and lack of transparency, and lack of that strategic allocation of resources, and of course rule of law. The judicial system is not working, so people are just left to themselves in a situation where the media maze is enormous and confusing. You get all these sort of things. You've got a chip in your shoulder, you've got a COVID vaccine. And it's paradoxical, if you look at the end of the 19th century, a very similar situation was there with all that confusion that was going on and the conspiracy theories and what have you. So that's the bad news. But the good news is, and I think Ms. Gallagher mentioned that, is that the incentive is that people realize the economic and personal opportunities through those systems and the strategy to better their lives. And I would say that EU funding for local, regional, and national project has given great opportunity for private entrepreneurs and new companies to see that opportunity, including in the agricultural green sector, which I find very, very important. And the good news is that why I mentioned the Generation Z is that at the local level, education on climate change is ongoing now. And these young children or teenagers are very much aware of that. There are all sorts of drives for them to clean up the sea coast, et cetera, et cetera. So these are the opportunities for sustainability.
Okay.
If we provide a conducive and good governance environment.
So just to summarize a little, would you perceive that we shouldn't worry too much about the disinformation side and focus more on the incentivization of participation? Is that what's in it for me has got to be answered? Well, this is what's in it for you, and there's a tangible return, tangible benefit for the individual citizen and for the local community. Dasha?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's very difficult. It will be very difficult to change the media the media maze and the media disinformation or information systems. But I think that what it is for me is the basic thing in a situation where we have, particularly in some societies, already broken the social fiber and already disrupted solidarity frameworks.
All right, thank you. Stay with us. We're going to come back to some of these topics in a few minutes again as well. Let's bring in our next panel for discussion on innovation, economy, and global competition capacity. Our distinguished panelists with us now, John Hassler, a PhD from MIT, Professor of Economics at the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University. John's in Stockholm today. And we also have Dirk Hollemans. He's the co-president of the European Green Foundation. John, good to have you with us. Do you want to kick off with your introductory comments?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm a macroeconomist, but my research for the last 10 years have been on climate policy and the interaction between the economy and the climate change. And in a sense, one can say that the starting point for my analysis is that Earth has been on a quite risky path towards more and more global warming for quite some time. We don't know exactly what's gonna happen. We don't know exactly how sensitive climate is to emissions, nor how sensitive our welfare is to climate change, but it's risky for sure. and we should try to stop it. And to analyze these things, we also must think about what the fundamental cause for these problems are. And I say that is that using atmosphere's capacity to absorb CO2, which is a global resource, a global natural resource in limited supply. Using this has been and is still largely free to use and up for grabs for anyone. And we know from lots of examples in history and also nowadays that when we have a natural resource that exists in limited supply, but is free to use in unlimited quantities, we get overuse, regardless of whether we talk about trees in the forests, fish in the oceans, or the atmosphere's capacity to absorb CO2, as in this case. So this is the problem. This is the fundamental problem, that this natural resource is up for grabs for free. The problem is not growth, neither in population nor in GDP, although it's clear that these growth trends often exacerbate the consequences of free access to natural resources. And the problem is neither too little investments or too little R&D or short-termism in business or too little government involvement and too much markets. These are not the problems. It is that access to the natural resource I'm talking about is unlimited. And this problem must be solved. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to change this risky path that Earth is on. And a very natural way of solving the problem is to establish property rights to this natural resource in the form of an emission trading system. And such a system puts an absolute limit on emissions and then uses markets to allocate those emissions in the most efficient way. Preferably, of course, this system should be global, because climate change is a global phenomenon driven by aggregate global accumulated emissions. But if this is not possible, to have a global system, we should at least aim for as large as possible system. And that's why I think that the EU emission trading system is an excellent system and should be a role model for the rest of the world. We now need to phase out the allocation of emission rights faster in order to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. But this is, as we all know, on the agenda now, on the tables. So EU's EU ETS is a very good system. The effort sharing regulation, on the other hand, covering emissions not in the EU ETS, is a much worse system, both in terms of achieving emission reductions and in terms of efficiency. And what we see in this system is is a large number of overlapping, uncoordinated, and sometimes conflicting policies, often just moving emissions outside the national borders. And we see, for example, in Sweden, that the Swedish government transport agency has calculated that it's about 10 times as expensive to reduce emissions within the effort sharing regulation as it is in the EU ETS, even with the big rise in emission prices that we have seen in the EU ETS. So I think that the proposal from the Commission to tighten the existing EU ETS and to introduce a new emission trading system for transportation and heating is really of essential importance for Europe to become carbon neutral by 2050. If this system is introduced, it gives us full control over emissions over all future, and we can calculate the contribution of our emissions to global warming, and that will be around 0.02 degrees for all emissions that we plan for the remaining time until we become carbon neutral. And we do it in the most efficient, economically efficient way too. So that's something that we should really be proud over. And I think that if these systems are introduced, it's a complete game changer also, in the sense that not only will emissions be under full control, but it will mean that many other policies of the sort that I was talking about before, focusing on national emissions, carbon footprints of firms, of organizations, and even on individuals, all these things will be superfluous. We can abolish them, and that will be a great benefit, I think. So the remaining threat then to EU's climate targets, and this is certainly not a small threat, and we have been talking about it already, is that the system becomes politically unstable because of popular discontent. But then the focus of climate policy, when these things have been introduced that are now on the tables, so the new EU ETS and the tighter EU ETS and the new emission trading system, the focus should then be totally on making it acceptable for households and firms to live and thrive within this system. So distributional policies will become very important, of course. And an example will be that maybe we should give back the revenues from the emission trading system directly to households. I would make it kind of clear that what's in it for them, in a sense. We need to have labor market policy and training to help people find and be qualified for new jobs that are going to replace those that the old dirty ones. We need industrial policy aimed at helping the transition, including streamlining of permission processes for installation of green infrastructure. And we need lots of policy to make sure that power production and transmission of power works well. So these are going to be key components. And in a sense, I think that the required policies here are very, in a fundamental way, similar to the kind of policies that are necessary to make other transitions acceptable to people, like the digital transformation, the transformation to service, the service economy, and so on. So, but what is not needed then are measures that make it more complicated to live in the system. So, as I said, national and local emission targets, including, I think, most of the effort sharing regulation. And I would count also here the new taxonomy, additional taxes, rules for procurement, for calculating carbon footprints for individuals, and so on. These are examples of things that make it more difficult and risks the political stability of the system by making it harder and not easier to prosper within the system. And shaming people for their carbon footprint and require them to stating that they need to kind of change their lifestyle in very fundamental ways, that these are equally bad, and those policies should be abolished or not introduced. And if we can do that, then I think Europe is on its way towards climate neutrality, and we can show the rest of the world that this can be done also in a heterogeneous region like EU. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. And Derek, over to you.
Also from my side, many thanks for being able to speak here. And I must say it already has been very interesting, the different speakers, so many thanks. And I agree with former speakers that if we have to talk about transformation of our society. It's really a big endeavor. It's not just piecemeal engineering. And so it will include all domains of policy and society, and of course, and also our fiscal system. And also this is, as Christina said, about the social contract between different generations. Yes, as it has been said, the younger generations are really also a big source of hope for us. Maybe this is a topic for another debate, but to be honest, I don't agree that economic growth is not a problem, or I think we have different views on how strong the market can relate to everything. But for instance, if you look at economic decoupling, it is true, it is happening in certain countries in the field of emissions, but it is certainly not yet happening in the field of use of resources. So, but probably this is a topic for a different debate. But I agree 100% that if we need transformative changes, we also need them in our fiscal system. It is clear that, talking from the perspective of Belgium or Western Europe, we still have a fiscal model of the 20th century. We tax a lot labor, and we tax very little the use of nature and capital. And as we live in an era of digitalization and climate crisis, it is clear we really need a new fiscal system. And of course, we know that carbon pricing is one of the strongest instruments. We are implementing the ETS system. So I agree it is very important, and I think former speakers have emphasized its importance. Charles Delbeke has shown how the price now is going up of carbon, so I think ETS will have a lot of impact. But I think we have to be careful to emphasize that I think carbon pricing is not a silver bullet solution. We need other policies that drive investment and innovation. And it already has been said here, but I really want to emphasize is we really have to have a closer look on the social aspects of carbon pricing on just transition. Because as we know, the expansion of ETS into domains like public transport and building sectors will have an immediate impact on consumers. This means that lower income households will be hit hardest, and they will ask themselves at the end of the month, are we still able to pay the bill of heating our houses? Are we still being able to pay our transport to go to our job? And so Charles Delbeke said we have to be pragmatic, and the fact is that driving electric is cheap. It's true, but buying an electric car is very expensive. So, and I think we all have observed what happened in France with the yellow vests. For me, this was not a resistance against ecological policies, because in the end, the aim of ecological policies is to raise the quality of life. But the yellow vest shows that without adequate social policies, carbon pricing can lead to two unwanted and dangerous results. First, of course, the most straightforward is that it will increase social inequality, which already we have in Europe, and with the COVID crisis becomes even larger. But I think, secondly, if climate policies increase fear in the heart of people, fear, for instance, that they can't pay warming their houses anymore, then this creates insecurity and anxiety, which we know is a breeding ground for political forces that are not in favor of green transformation. So I really agree with what has been said, that this idea of carbon dividend, giving back part of the taxes, the carbon taxes or the carbon pricing, giving it back directly to people, is a crucial idea. It's much more ambitious than a social climate fund. And if we would organize this at the European level, then I think Europe would become very concrete to people. It would mean not just a cost and a lot of policies, but it would also mean an income for people that find it hard to pay the bill at the end of the month. So I think this could be part of what I think we need is a new social contract. We need a new eco-social contract that provides freedom and security for all people in Europe. And I think this is, for me, the challenge of the Conference for the Future of Europe. We don't need piecemeal engineering or small changes. We really need, in the light of the current challenges that all have been already discussed today, and of course COVID has added one extra, we really need to have a narrative so we can explain to the people that we want to take care of them. And this is maybe also a good point to finish. I think the concept of care is really lacking in a lot of policy narratives. We think that with the COVID crisis, care was in the heart of the public debate. And of course, in the beginning of the COVID crisis, we were applauding for people working in hospitals. We were looking into the effects of cutting forests. But I think now, 2 years later, people in hospitals working there rather feel alone. And we are still cutting forests to, for instance, feed our cattle. So I think, how can we make this concept of care operational in a narrative of the future of Europe? This is really, for me, a key challenge. What would it mean if we could build a care democracy? What would it mean if we really take care of nature? What would it mean that we want to take care of our world so we can give it to our children in a better state than it is today? I think this is for me the fundamental question if we look at building new policies and politics.
Derek, thank you for that. Let's draw out some of these issues as well. Let's start with care and how this translates into the macroeconomic picture as well. So many Europeans are facing food poverty and fuel poverty as well. And like you pointed out, the Gilets jaunes arose not out of an anguish about climate policy or an adversity towards greener issues, but because the burden of cost was seen to be falling upon those who thought they were least able to afford that as well. So, John, how do we translate carbon pricing to the level of the citizen, where either they don't need to think about it, or it's presented to them as being value for money and done in a fair, equitable way, which they can understand? You got a simple answer for that?
No, but I think also, I mean, it's very important to recognize these, and as I stressed very hardly, if we get these systems in place, the remaining threat is that they might be overturned if people don't accept them. So this is very important, and all policy must be directed on this. Then one should though not maybe exaggerate the problem either, and the fact is that in EU as well as in the rest of OECD, the problem is not so much that we don't price emissions by households, but that we don't price emissions by firms. And if we were to have a joint emission trading system for industry and households, I think it seems like people are most worried about that industry would protest, not that the prices would be so high for households. So the current price on emission rights, for example, that translates into something like 10-15 euro cents per liter of gasoline, and compared to all the other taxes that everyone pays, at least in the EU, it's not immensely high. But people can nevertheless be unhappy with the system, and then I think kind of connecting the system directly to their personal wallets by, for example.
Let me ask you exactly on this, because you were talking about Gen Z earlier, and Dasha was highlighting as well. You know, if we can't measure something, we tend to disregard it. And this is a generation that likes to measure everything from calories to heartbeats to steps taken as well. Do we have the data, John, to be able to more or less accurately present to individual citizens their cost in terms of this natural resource? Where they fit in this picture? So it's not just a matter of how far you drive or how much carbon you burn, but the fact that you bought this product in Amazon and that has a traceable carbon footprint all the way through. So that is part of the cost as well. Are we able to do something close to that today, where we can explain the economics of this, or simply the cost benefit to the individual citizen?
It's going to be very difficult to measure the carbon content in all imports. So I think we need to focus rather on what we are doing within Europe. And then the proposals that have come from the Commission, I think, do this exactly. And I think you can connect it to the household wallet by doing something quite similar to what we have done in the EU ETS. When that was introduced, of course, there were lobbies against it from industry, but they were largely shut up by actually the promise that many of the emission allowances were to be given for free to them. And this could be done also to households, and then you get like personal interest in the system too, which I think is the way forward. When it comes to emissions outside of EU, we need to kind of, by using the carrot and the stick, convince the rest of the world to introduce something similar that we have done. I don't think we can do it in other ways. Maybe trade policy is something to do there, but I think kind of calculating exactly the carbon content in every good that we import, that's not going to be functional.
Okay. Dirk, you take the same view? Do you think it's just too complicated to do it that way? Would you prefer that we focus on industry, which is a more tangible data point for this kind of policy as well? Or do you think we're simply doing a bad job at explaining to citizens that the larger burden should fall on industry?
Well, I think that we really need this kind of carbon border tax, because otherwise, if we only use the carrot and the stick and we wait until we have convinced, for instance, China, then you could have two superpowers watching each other. So I think we really have to be bold on this and really say if we put a price on carbon, we put a price on all products and resources carbon related, because otherwise it's hard to see how our companies can stay competitive.
They do with the free allocation, right, of emission allowances. That's a system that has worked well in that respect. It doesn't put pressure on China. That's true. So,
but it's a bit strange to say that we keep the system working by giving free allowances.
That's what we should do to households, I think. So it's similar.
So, but maybe one point of the ETS is it raises money, which now goes to governments. So I would really insist on this proposal of carbon dividends, where you implement a system and you really give people an income, for instance, maybe 100 euros a month. And then you have this kind of, if we think bold, you could say this is a start of a European, call it a transition income, which really will make people feel, okay, the European cares for me. They know my bill to warm my house is going up. And then I think this can be a start of, I wouldn't call it a kind of a European welfare state, because welfare was a concept of the 20th century. Maybe we have to build a well-being state, European well-being state in the 21st century. And this could be a really tangible part of it. Because if you look back at how the welfare state was built, it was not built in the big scheme at 1 year. It was many decades with many building blocks, and then actually we used the time of the Second World War to put it together into national schemes. So I think we now have to experiment, introduce building blocks of I would call a well-being society, and then see how the experiments work or don't work, and then have these eco-social contracts for Europe, and of course in a global context. That's clear.
No, I think that's a very good idea, and I fully support that. And I think it rhymes also with my view on the natural resource. And this is something that the Earth capacity, limited capacity to emit to absorb CO2, is a natural resource that belongs to people. It doesn't belong to firms. It doesn't belong to Brussels. It belongs to people. And when we sell it, the people should get it back, the revenue. So I think that's a very good idea, and I support it fully.
But in the end, though, does the value of the revenue return to the citizen not simply become another political football where each party running for office promises that we'll raise this by 20%, and when Brussels doesn't agree to it, well, it's Europe's fault. Europe's not supporting you any longer. If we get down to the amount that you're going to get back, is that the wrong policy message?
I don't think we should have a tax. I think we should have an emission trading system, and then people are actually owning this, and when it's sold, they get the revenue. So and then we'll see what the price is. So having kind of a tax instead, I think, is more complicated politically.
No, but even in terms of the revenue that you return to people, that's to say you have an allowance which is guaranteed, and how you index that will be discussed. But
no, it's not a guarantee. You get the revenue, so you get like a share. You can think of it that you get the number of free allowances that you can use yourself or sell.
All right. So let's talk about the innovation in this. What needs to be used, which is already on the market, and where can we learn from in terms of other commercial enterprises and how they deal with citizens as consumers to nudge behavior as well? What do we see in terms of opportunities which we're not grasping here as well? And as a journalist, I always find it a useful exercise to ask, well, with this policy, what would Amazon do? If you're talking about the migrant crisis, how would Amazon manage this? You get a very different perspective in terms of how the logistics of things can be moved. So what can we learn from the commercial world as well in terms of innovation and global competition? John?
Well, I think that we can learn that markets are extremely powerful in providing what is demanded. And now if we see the emission trading system is going to imply that flying within the union on fossil fuel is not going to be possible after 2040, because then if the proposal from the Commission is going through, so then is the airlines that can, or fly or plane manufacturers that can't provide fossil-free flying, they will have to go out of business. Will they find a way? Yes, I'm sure they will.
Okay, so innovation driven by need, ultimately. Dirk?
Yeah.
Well, I would say I wouldn't ask the question, what would Amazon do? Because I prefer firms that pay taxes and treat their workers well, to be honest. But I would put it in another, I would turn your question around. Mm-hmm. If I look at the housing market in Europe, we have an extremely large amount of not well insulated houses. We have a lot of houses not with good isolated glass windows. We don't have a lot of solar panels. So how come that companies have not been able to make much more business models out of it? Because with energy prices going up, you have examples for these ESCOs, these energy saving companies that say to you, you don't have to take care. I will insulate your house. I will put solar panels on your roof. And the only thing you do is the next 10 years, you pay the same amount for your energy bill as you did before. So I would really challenge industry to develop a European-wide plan so that within the next 20 years, all our houses are fit for the future.
Excellent. Thank you. John, anything to add to that?
And I'm actually answering a question here that I got in the chat here on whether climate policies need to have a negative effect on growth. And I think that we now have pretty strong evidence that a clever climate policy need not have negative effects on growth. But then it must be based on pricing. If you do, there is certainly ways of making EU or Sweden or the world climate neutral in a way that severely reduces growth. but you don't need to follow that way.
Excellent. And just a final word on social contract as well. What do you envisage in terms of social contract, in terms of what governments can do and what Europe can do in terms of the economy, and how we can be either insulated or more competitive in the global economy as well? Can we put climate change front and center of a social contract as a way of guaranteeing that we will take care of you, our citizens, in this context? Dirk.
Well, I think the starting point would be planetary boundaries. We have discussing today climate policies, which is very important, but we all know that, for instance, the collapse of biodiversity is seen by scientists as even important. So I think the restoration and the maintenance of our natural world has to be a key part of this eco-social contract. So this, I know this makes it a bit more complex, but we really have to be able to combine the challenges of climate and biodiversity, which, of course, now the European Commission for the first time has been put together on the table. But if scientific reports show that collapse of biodiversity is at least as severe as climate change, so I think we have to put it under the protection of the natural world, which actually we are part of.
Okay, John, just to tie on to that as well, we can't have a one-size-fits-all policy for this, clearly, because if you live in a coastal area, your perception of risk in this environment is very different than if you live in a sort of a quiet suburb of one of Europe's big cities as well. Do you think that we can have a broad approach to this, or do we really need to go region by region and community by community?
Well, here you must separate the policy in order to deal with emissions from what is needed for people to thrive within the system and what's needed for adaptation to the climate change that we anyway will see. And for the first part, curbing emissions, there the policy should be as high up as possible. For all the rest, they need to be suited to the local needs. And that's why I think it's important to separate these things. So on the world level, preferably, but if we can't at the EU level, put the price on emission through an emission trading system, and then many of the other policies need to be much more local.
Okay. Thank you for that. Now we're going to switch over and do some Q&A from our audience who've been eagerly sending in some questions. We have our members, former members of the European Parliament on there, of course, and also our students and a broad spectrum of Europe's great society as well. So let me start from the top. Some are comments and some are questions. And Margarita Stokoviciut, sorry for mispronouncing your surname. What I'm missing in the data, this is for Joss earlier as well, but I read the comment, is the comparison of changes in nature well back in ages. It was well documented that changes in continent shape, cold and heat moments. We're only focusing the last 100 years. And let me see, what can be expected from a new EU founding treaty? This one came from Roman Petrov. Hans-Gert, do you want to have a go at that? What can be expected for a new EU founding treaty in the context of the green transition?
This is a question we have not discussed in the former members association. I think this is a task and a responsibility for the Parliament and the Commission. Okay,
that was well deflected. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Okay, coal mines, again from Margarita, coal mines, it's possible to phase out in land, could be reactivated, but what about nuclear power stations and where do we move radioactive waste? Well, let's put this in the context of nuclear power as well. Any of our panelists want to touch on this as well? I know there were some announcements. France is keen to reactivate the nuclear dimension too. Dasha, any comments on this?
Another question onto it. And what about solar power?
Yes.
I think there's much more understanding about the introduction of solar power, the subsidies that go with it, than just discussing nuclear power. But that is a big question. I think we need to review those opportunities and possibilities, and we are not doing it. We're either reacting, but not being able to put them on into a basket and try to figure that out. So I would actually opt, and I see that there's much more buy-in among the population, the public, on the solar side of it, and maybe something that could be given much more prominence in the transition. Thank you,
Eva.
Yes, thank you. We have a lot of debate on this also in the EPP. Our different parties from different member states have various positions on, for example, nuclear. But I think also in terms of the current energy crisis in Europe and the challenges for the population, we have the position that nuclear energy is a factor and it's a contributing player in achieving this green transition in some member states. And for example, in this regard, we are awaiting the Commission's delegated act on whether nuclear can qualify for financing, for example, in the taxonomy regulation, which was mentioned. So this is an important debate to be had, and I think different member states have different views on it, but it should be seen as a possible tool to achieve this transition. Yes.
Thank you. Dirk, you surely have an opinion on this.
Yeah, sure. And maybe I can give you breaking news. We are in the midst of the discussion of closing our nuclear plants in Belgium. And so the company ENGIE, it was just 1 minute ago, sent a letter to the government that prolonging the use is impossible. So it will be very interesting to see what happens the coming days. But apart from seeing an opportunity or not in nuclear plants, which I think is a separate debate, I don't see an opportunity. But I think from the point of view of climate policy, I think we all can agree that building nuclear plants takes a lot of years. So for reducing our emissions the coming 10 to 20 years, I hardly see how nuclear energy could play a crucial role. I think that's, for me, a bit of factual observation. And I'm not against research. If there are new concepts developed, I'm open to it. But I'm an engineer, and I'm already in the field for more than 30 years. And from already I was a student, there was this big news that there will be developed new small nuclear reactors without nuclear waste, but I only have seen them on PowerPoints until now.
John, thank you.
Yeah, this is a very lively discussion in Sweden, and has been actually for decades about these things too. And we are now discussing whether the facilities for storing waste are acceptable or not, and we hope to see a decision soon on that. I'm a bit more optimistic maybe than Dirk on this, and maybe European regulation and national regulation has made it more difficult to build nuclear power plants than what we otherwise would have seen. There was a scientist saying that in France, where they succeeded in building fairly cheap and fairly fast, if you compare that to the US, where the opposite is the case, the scientist said that in France they have one type of nuclear power plants and 100 types of cheeses. In the US we have the opposite, and that's why they are so much better on nuclear power plants and we are so much worse on cheese. But we'll see. I think it's clear that you cannot treat solar and wind as perfect substitute to nuclear, because nuclear is a steady power source, whereas the others are not. So the more wind and solar you have in the system, the more volatile prices, all else equal. Of course, not everything is all else equal, but this means that the less nuclear we have, the more you need of other things that make it possible to live within a system where energy prices fluctuate. But this is probably possible. So it's clear to me that nuclear power is not necessary for the transition. That's clear. Although I think it would be good if we have some of it.
Excellent. I just reading this morning in the British press that wine and cheese could lead to the downfall of the British government after a party there, which clearly the French are completely responsible for the downfall of the Tory party. So Dirk, also one thing comes to mind, Isabel Kosher, who was the former CEO, the first female CEO of ENGIE for some time in France, she was instrumental in leading the transformation of ENGIE into a company which depended largely on renewable energy as well. Maybe take a less glossy view of this, Dirk, but she didn't survive with this strategy at the head of ENGIE. Do traditional energy companies need to make this leap, or can they be compelled to make this leap to renewable energies, Dirk?
I think that Charles Delbeke already said it, the price of renewable energies, wind and sun, is dropping every year. So we now see the first big wind farms in sea without public subsidies.
Okay.
So I think energy companies that say we don't go into renewables, I don't think that they will have a long lifespan. Okay.
The question here is coming on Facebook. Constant reference to leadership, but we have leaders. Should present leaders do more or better? Easy answer there. Or do we need new leaders? Maybe not such an easy answer. It's from Michael Hindley, coordinator for European Parliament to Campus Programme as well. Thank you for that, Michael. Dasha, the current crop of world leaders, best we've ever had?
We have a big problem. We have the visible leaders who are actually confusing the environment, and we've seen that with Donald Trump plus the Orbans of this world and so on, which is actually poisoning our attempts in many fields and making that chaos and confusion in people's minds. That's the first thing. The second thing, I still think our leaderships are entrenched in the old ways of thinking and unable to do their own transition into where we want to go. And I think—
What does that mean? What is the old way of thinking? Politics is one of the oldest sports out there.
Well, we either have a thing that, the role of the state is the father and the mother, or we have that the private sector is the father of mother. The question of how we are dealing with globalization, the pros and the cons, it was great all the end of the 80s, and then the thing erupted, and then we got into a situation saying, well, we did learn something from it, and it's volatile and it may be disruptive in certain sense. And I think that all these, and the positive side of it, if you look at how new leaderships and leaders are coming, I think we may be seeing new leaders. It's a bit of getting out of the box, because we are getting out of the box. So who's going to, take us forward to get out of the box? Certainly the leaders we have learned, know a lot and should be there. But I think we're going to see quite a lot of new leaders cropping up. I'm not very sure, however, that these new young leaders will necessarily be conducive to that, I think, democratic and sustainable overhaul in view of the current political trends.
All right. Hans-Gert, you spoke at the very beginning about architects of community and economy as well. How do you see this? I was, the last few days, coming from Washington through Paris and into Brussels, I was asking a lot of people, and especially taxi drivers, about their concepts of leadership and who they liked as leaders. A lot of people went back to the Chirac, Blair, Clinton era as well. And these bigger personalities on the stage than perhaps many of today's leaders, and a lot of people mentioned the same kind of characters as well, which I find a little surprising. What's missing from today's leadership, or has leadership changed? Have the personalities changed, or has all the noise around leadership deafen some of the messaging and some of the talent that is there?
Brian, thank you very much for asking me this question, but I'm quite frank. I think it's not the right question to say, do we need new leaders? It's a question, when there are new leaders, what they do. Just changing leaders doesn't mean anything. To have another President Trump is not something I would like to see. Even he was a new leader 5 years ago. So it's a question of the quality of the politicians. And in my country, in Germany, I think he might have been elected.
He has. I was checking. He's already.
We have a new chancellor. I personally would have seen another one, but this is democracy, and this is the answer to the question concerning new leaders. If you accept a democratic system, you have to accept in the end what the majority wants. And in Germany, we have now, for the first time in our history, a three-party government. We had it already in the past, but CDU and CSU are two parties, but they are regarded as one. And now we have a social democrat-led government with Chancellor Scholz, and we have the Green Party and the Liberals. So this is in itself very complex, but they represent the majority of the German people. And so this is a new government, and I wish this government and all other governments in the European Union and in the world that they are following our European values. And the last thing I want to say, the European Union, and I was a parliamentarian for 35 years, and we fought against our governments partly, but peacefully. But we took the lead, and some of our panelists spoke about it. The European Union took the lead in the fight against climate change. The first legislation was signed the 23rd, if I remember the date exactly. The first legislation concerning climate change was signed the 23rd of April 2009, with the aim to reduce CO2 by 20% in 2020. And I think we achieved this. And so we should be self-confident. We are not perfect as the European Union, but we should be more self-confident, and we should trust, if you take everything together, our democratic institutions.
Thank you. John, does Sweden have a prime minister this week, or is that next week? How's that working out?
Yeah, we got a new one recently. She was my student, so I hope she's going to do well.
It's vested interest. Very good.
But I certainly agree what we just heard, that another Swede named Greta says that nothing is happening. It's just blah, blah, blah. This is completely wrong. I mean, things are happening, and the proposals that we see now from the Commission, with the support largely from the Parliament, that's gonna put sufficient limits on emissions in the EU, and that we should be proud of. And that's done by our current politicians. So things are certainly happening, and that's important to bring out to people, because that's going to be helpful if we're going to, if the support for these policies and for the institutions are going to survive.
Okay, thank you, Dirk, and then Eva for this question as well. So this question comes from somebody whose name is not it. So question speakers: European communities are founded on coal and steel, which are now being blamed for the global climate and ecological crisis. Can the Green Deal plan succeed without a political refoundation or profound ecological, economic and social reform of Europe focusing on this emergency? Eva, Europe 2.0, is that what we're going to see here with the Green Deal?
Possibly, I would hope so. Maybe if the first European community was founded on the notion of joining coal and steel, maybe this 2.0 is to be founded on green and digital coming together and helping this transition. So I think we are seeing this paradigm shift needed for us to achieve the climate goals. And I think we have to move on from let's say the notions of the past. And even the steel community that was mentioned, and steel sector, there is a huge innovation going on in the sector, new ways of producing with lower emissions. So we are not putting these sectors out of business. They need to be part of the transition. And also there we are seeing that we can do things differently. And coming to the previous question, sure, on leadership and leaders, Angela Merkel in her farewell speech mentioned that biggest asset of a politician is trust. So I think this is what any leader that comes to office has to build up with the citizen and voters, and to put trust in his policies and his vision, his or her vision.
Mr. Trump's supporters trust him implicitly. Let's learn that lesson too. Dirk, just on this as well, Europe 2.0, I think we've spoken in previous events about the European Union being essentially a peace project. Dasha outlined quite clearly the risks to our democracy as well. Is the green and digital Europe 2.0 the continuation of peace and prosperity for Europe?
Well, I think the question really goes to, do we need a refoundation of the reform? So I think, and also the question on Joep started with coal and steel, it's a good one, because this reminds me to the writings of Rifkin, who says that every area has a kind of interweaving of specific technologies and means of energy, transport, and communication. So we really live in a totally different era. If we look back when the European Union started, it is not anymore about fossil fuels as energy. It's not anymore the print media. It's not anymore only trains and trucks that use coal or diesel. So we have a new, you could call it, nexus of new technologies that have a profound impact not only on industry but also how we live and also on how we communicate. If we start talking about social media, Facebook, echo chambers, and so it really has changed everything. So in a way we are in, I would say, in a complex situation where we need to do two things at the same time. Move very fast on green politics, the Green Deal, and I think the Green Deal is a good example of leadership at the level of Europe. I think we really have to say that from all. But at the same time, we have to build room for being reflective and really try to analyze what all these changes really mean, how we communicate, how we can work together, and from this build these new contracts. And for instance, you raised, what can we learn from Amazon or Facebook? I think what we can learn from this is that digital platforms are crucial, but I don't see our governments building and using digital platforms that embrace and enhance democratic values. So I would also put this on the table. A few years ago, I wrote an op-ed and I put a question on table: what if tomorrow Trump would work together with the CEO of Facebook and they build together a political party?
Could you tell the difference?
Well, what I want to say with that, they would probably be very successful. So we really have to also to invest in new ways of communicating with citizens, new way of public debates. And I think, for instance, these what we call citizens' assemblies, citizen juries, as for instance has been organized in France. Macron did it after the raise of the yellow vest to bring 100 citizens together to discuss climate policy. I think this is one of the proposals for the future.
Thank you. Trust
in people, trust in citizens, and bring them together and let them formulate what they think together are the best policies, because the results were quite convincing. And you could say that's maybe the irony. If you put 100 citizens together in a good environment, they show more leadership than certain political leaders.
Okay, Dasha, you want to follow up on that?
I certainly do. The question you raised, Dirk, was the question of the quick wins. Do we have quick wins for building trust? And I think that's going to be very important. When I mention the priorities, I think we need to think about that. On the nuclear, just a point, it's interesting. I have an interesting example. There's a whole discussion in Croatia, for instance, on the nuclear, but from the environment sector lobby. But on the other hand, the nuclear is in Slovenia. And the Slovenia one, so we are getting into a border discussion on, should we have it or not? And that's an interesting example. On the new ways of communicating, I couldn't agree with you more, Dirk. We have excellent experiences with town hall meetings. And not only in the Western Balkans, town hall meetings, individual countries, but across countries, to bring those different perspectives. And I think what we've done, and whenever I learned about it from people who are experts, is they say, fine, the digital is fine, but we need human contact. We need that human interface in order to get either the messages across or build that solidarity. So I would, I would certainly try to bring us a bit back from that digital. We've seen a huge problem with the digital, and we didn't even touch much of the digital challenges we're going to have, from the fact that we are marginalizing certain groups of population that are unable to follow the digitalization and modernization environment. And that in the new generations can be a problem. You mentioned the platforms. Then we've had the problem with the Trumps of this world of how do you, or the Orbans, whoever, how you're going to manage the platforms. Is the fact that the Twitter has shut down Donald Trump? Is that the question? These are all really democracy issues, and I think they warrant much more on the digital side than just saying we're getting into a new digital revolution. That's simple. But the fallouts, and we are seeing in the pandemic, now let's go back to the pandemic. We're seeing a huge problem, for instance, in the rise of violence, the internet violence. And we are seeing a huge problem of anxiety. And I think Dirk mentioned the word anxiety and the angst among the younger generations that are now seeking help. So, let's not just jump into it as a new paradigm, but actually look at those questions as Europe, because I think that's where we need to be leaders in Europe. And I think, we at some point we seem to have been losing ourselves as being those leaders, and we have so much to say and so much to be leaders on in the world. And the question, I think the Secretary General mentioned it in his opening remarks on the role of Europe in the world.
Thank you. John, you studied in the United States, didn't you? Yeah, so do you think Europeans take for granted what they have? This is my opinion. And it's the idea that our health system doesn't work well enough in Europe compared to United States is just, the scale is incomparable. The education system, again, incomparable. The quality of democracy, incomparable as well. Are Europeans complaining too much?
Of course.
There's nobody listening. You can speak freely.
Well, that's a very tough question to answer. But of course, what you said from the beginning, that we kind of relatively quickly take for granted what we have, that's certainly true. I grew up in Europe with borders where you couldn't travel, you couldn't take out money as you wanted, and so on. And now my kids, they take all that for granted, and they don't realize that that's actually an achievement. That's a political achievement by our leaders, and we should try to kind of to give credit to what has happened and what we have created. At the same time, as of course we also complain about the things that don't work well, and there are certainly issues there too. And finding that balance, that's what democracy is about. So I don't have a good answer.
Just in terms of the speed of change, my eldest daughter is 15, and it horrifies her that she is exactly the same age as Facebook. So in 15 years, the change and the shift in our communication ability and mentality is massive compared to previous generations as well. And it concerns me a little that 5, 10, 15 years from now as well, we just have no clue of what we're going to be facing as well. Quick comment on that, Dasha, and I'll bring another question.
Yes, Brian, I'm from there. If you look at the current, the positive is if you look at the current division in the United States and the dialogue that's happening, you're actually seeing that universal healthcare is an issue, which is very much on the agenda, especially among the young generations, ecological issues and so on. So there is a big divide now in the United States on these ideological issues, looking at Europe. I mean, read the papers, Washington Post, New York Times, of course, we read what we like. But there is, and I think that is an extremely encouraging sign when we start talking about the effect of the New Deal and so on, and what it meant and so on. So I think the Americans are now starting to realize that this COVID business has given rise to actually a more introspection into the system.
Well, when you say Americans, we've got Texas, we've got Florida, and we've got we have Washington, New York, which are a different planetary system altogether. All right, I'm going to get into stuff with Texas now. My question concerns, this one comes from Jean-Pierre Audi. Thank you very much, sir. My question concerns a subject close to my opinion, a lack of democratic control over global governance. Democratic control exists at the state level, but not at the level of the United Nations Organization, G20, G7, etc. What is your assessment of the democratic and political control of world supranational organizations which operate practically only with heads of state or government or ministers? Let's hear from Eva and Hans-Gert in this first. Eva, what do you think? Is this fair that the G20, G7 are really beyond political control? We could say the same of the European Council if we apply the same dynamics there.
Well, those leaders still have been elected to their posts.
Exactly.
Sometimes it's good to have discussion also in a smaller circle. They set the agenda, I think, and hopefully they are able to build some consensus in this more constricted setting. I think they still have to answer to their voters. So whether they discuss these policies in G7, the Council, or being questioned by parliamentarians, if they are democratically elected, they do have a mandate from the citizens to take some decisions.
Sure. Thank you. Hans-Gert.
Yes, I will see in another conference in a little bit more than 1 hour Jean-Pierre Audi. We were colleagues in the European Parliament, and Jean-Pierre, we will discuss these questions personally. But in this conference, I want to give an answer to the question what the European Union really is and the democratic system. I think each generation has its new challenges, and this generation now has the challenge not only of climate change, which might be the biggest challenge, but there's a question of security, there's a question of democratic systems. Do we prefer authoritarian systems or even a totalitarian system? And I say no, we need to have a democratic system, and a democratic system, of course, has always mistakes as well. Nothing is perfect. We are not living in a paradise, but the European Union, and I am not too positive now as far as the European Union is concerned, but the European Union and its member states, they are the better part of the world. I'm deeply convinced. And in the European Union, if you take the European Parliament, we have a real democracy now. When we started with the first parliament in 1979, the European Parliament had no legislation power. And now we have power, for instance, in legislation concerning climate change and in all questions of European legislation without taxes. That there is still the unanimous vote in the Council. The European Parliament is a full partner of the governments. And I think this is a great success. And I think the most decisive is that we accept the principle unity in diversity in the world and in the European Union, and that we accept our different cultural backgrounds, but that we are united in our European legislation. And I think in this sense, the European Union is a unique example, and we have together meet the great challenges. And the legislation concerning climate change is a very good example that the Europeans in the European Union took the lead, and now others are following step by step. And so let's be self-confident. Let's be optimistic. The glass is at least half full.
Very good. Thank you. I want to read out some comments here, and then I'll bring in some other responses as well. And we're going to take another question on farming too. Margarita Stokovic, two former MEP as well. Some comments here. The first thing that totalitarian leaders do, they ban Christmas. Well, when European Commission came with a proposal not to use the word Christmas, it looks like EU leaders departing from ideas of founding members, or perhaps it looks like the European Commissioner had nothing better to do. You can take different views on that, everybody. And Brigitte Langenhagen says that nobody's mentioning the print media in terms of democracy. They still play an important role spreading democratic or non-democratic news. And very true. Also radio is still more powerful than people imagine as well, and because it's community-based, locally based. And one of the biggest investments in media in recent years has actually been from Warren Buffett, who invested in buying up a whole bunch of local newspapers. The guy knows how to make money. Clearly there's a future in print still. And let's get to a couple of comments just to round off on the democratic comments that we've heard. And there's one other from Margarita, which is a little provocative. I'm going to read it anyway. We regret that all focus on communication, totalitarian approach. They establish propaganda departments as citizens, and they don't understand that rulers care about them. I'm not entirely sure that's correct, but thank you for the comment. Okay, let's some other comments on democracy before we finish on that for the moment. I'm going to go to farming and the Green Deal as well. Dasha. Are we just spinning our democracy? Is this all just propaganda, and those poor people sitting at home watching television don't know any better? Is that what we're dealing with?
Well, I mean, what is the reflection of that question? The reflection of that question is that we have much more work to do. And I would go back to Mr. Pöttering. I think you know, in that confusion, the understanding of what democracy really is in countries, especially which are not functioning democratically, it's a huge issue. We need. I'll give you an example. In Croatia, for instance, they try to introduce in the capital city civic education. You cannot imagine the amount of opposition to that. You can ask yourself why. What's the problem with civic education in the 21st century? So I think we need to do much more work on that. And we also, why not? I mean, let's open up some questions.
Thank you. Jean-Pierre Audi responded, an election is a designation and not a control. Quite right. John, any further comments on the state of our democracy and control now? Derek? Okay, let's go to the question on farming. Let me just scroll up again here to find this. So Mark Erwitz Rutke from the Euro Culture program at the University of Göttingen. And Mark says, what economic impact will the green transition strategy have on the future of farming in Europe? Nice big question there. Dirk?
Well, we all know by now that on one hand, the Green Deal included this farm to fork strategy, which was quite ambitious, reducing the use of pesticides, increasing the percentage of organic agriculture. But on the other hand, we know that the budget for the coming years of the Common Agricultural Policy, the CAP, has been voted and is actually only a kind of prolongation of the past. So I would say that agricultural policy at the European level is now somewhere in between the past and the future. But it's clear also, for instance, from climate policy, but also the protection of biodiversity, that we really have to change our agricultural policy. Because to put it a bit bluntly, on the one hand, we have farmers that don't get enough income and they have to produce every year more. And on the other hand, we as consumers, we not always get the healthy food at a good price. So I think the farm to fork strategy is a good strategy. It was an example of leadership, but I think now we have to continue the debate on the budgets, because it's absolutely, I would say, it doesn't make sense to go in one direction and then that the budgets don't follow. But if you look at erosion of soils, the health of the life in the soils, if you look at the impact of unhealthy food on the health of people, it is clear that we also here need a lot of transformative changes.
Gert, a big part of this comes down to trade policy as well. France is about to take up the leadership of Europe, the presidency. If you talk about phosphates and the quality of the soil, for example, we're buying in a lot from North Africa. This is intrinsically tied to political issues, and yet France knows very well that the phosphate level is not always at the safest volume in the food supply. So, are we playing politics with our food supply, with our farming, or is this the generation where we rebalance? We're producing at the right levels and producing healthier food. And also in terms of the macro level, I want to bring John in this in a second. If we talk about farming in the macro level, in the same way that we have carbon credentials not validated outside of the European Union so well, food to the same degree as well. Are we going to impose tougher restrictions on Europe's farmers producing higher quality food, and at the same time our trade policy allows leakage of poorer quality food or food with contaminants into the European food system? Are we putting a fence around all the risk elements for Europe's farmers here? Are we protecting them sufficiently?
I think if you speak with farmers, they really don't feel protected. More and more farmers, they quit their job. But the example you gave of phosphates is that we have globalized our food system, but the impact on the environment is immense. In Belgium, where I live, we feed pigs with soil coming from Brazil, where tropical forests have been cut to raise the soybeans. And then our government gives subsidies to export the meat to Russia. Mm. So I would say this is 20th century. All industrial sectors have to become carbon neutral. And so I think we don't have to put fences around Europe, but we have to be clear that if we also want to go carbon neutral, I think agricultural practices will become much more layered and some more local and regional. But to give one other example, which I find quite speaking, is sometimes the farmers in Belgium that produce milk are in trouble because the price of the milk in New Zealand goes down. So this raises the question, is food not something so essential that we don't leave it to the global markets?
Sure. I want to come back to Dash in a moment just to talk about food security as well, which you'd raised earlier. But John, at the macroeconomic level as well, going to Mark's question, what impact does the green transition strategy have on the future of farming in Europe? And from a macroeconomic perspective, what are the dynamics here?
I have to say that that's outside of my area of expertise. It's clear that also not considering climate policies, agriculture is an extremely politicized industry, basically everywhere. It's the same in the US, and that's risky in itself, I guess. But I really don't see that there is that climate policies will have to have any dramatic impacts on agriculture business. But whether anyway these things will happen, yeah, maybe.
Okay, Dasha, Eva, on this.
I would contribute something else. We have a body now in Europe, especially of small local farming that is green and ecological. The problem is that those nodes of local initiatives are unable to reach the markets. And we used to have cooperatives before and so on, and some are over there. But then, how do you use that as use them as a conduit to the national markets to start with, where you have big agricultural complexes that are relying on the fertilizers and the polluters of this world, and you have a lot of dumping from other countries of cheap foodstuffs. And so the problem is that we may get these totally disoriented and disincentivized farmers at the local level. The good news is we have on an island where we have an annual conference, the mayor is a woman, and she produces eco wines. So
always a good thing also. Thank you. Excellent. Eva, quick comment on this? We're going to, yes. then I'm going to ask each of you for short wrap-up remarks, and then I'll do some concluding remarks, then hand over to Hans-Gert. So that's the final stage we're at right now. So Eva.
Just 2 remarks on the topic of agriculture. Farm and fork strategy was mentioned, but already the farmers face strict restrictions, under the reformed CAP policy, the Common Agriculture Policy. So what is very worrying from our side in the EPP is the overlapping requirements we put on farmers, also the bureaucratic burden. And then indeed the younger generation of farmers which leave the sector, and it's very difficult to attract them. So I think this is of high concern to us, and farming indeed is one of the unique sector that faces the consequences of climate change, to which it has to adapt, but it also a sector that helps to mitigate the effects with the sinks and forests. So we have to take this into account. And what you mentioned, the role of trade policy, I think it's very important. It's another policy that actually can help drive climate policies. The EU is the biggest trading bloc globally, and it has this regulatory power to influence its trading partners to adopt some forms of climate measures and reducing emissions. So this is, I think, another important aspect.
Thank you. So let's start. I give you maximum 60 seconds each for your soundbite as well to take away from today's discussion as well. And the focus has been on green policy today, and where we go next with that. Just read the title again: was what the green transition can and should do for Europe. Dasha, what should the green transition do for Europe? 60 seconds.
New paradigm, new overhaul, and a new challenge that demands priorities, so that we can actually get that trust, get those quick wins, and be quite not be complacent, and follow up and monitor. And this has been for me a very, very important discussion, and I've learned so much. Thank you all, and thank you,
Dasha. Thank you so much. Derek, over to you. 60 seconds.
Also, thanks to all speakers. I learned a lot, me also, and I think for me the key message is that just transition should be at the heart of climate policy. How to build climate policies and a narrative that will convince citizens that their quality of life will increase and the future of their children can be secure. That's for me the key.
Dirk, thank you. John.
Yeah, I think we now have a very good opportunity to accept the proposals from the Commission and the Parliament. That's going to actually make sure that we don't emit more in the Union than what we need. And then a lot of other policies can be abolished, and policy can instead refocus on making the Union competitive and a good place to live in, where there is democracy and social inclusion.
Thank you. Eva.
Thank you, and thank you for the excellent discussion. I'm living with a sense of optimism. In the past, when we had the economic crisis, for example, 2010, the climate change crisis went a little bit on the back burner. Here we are recovering from the COVID-19 crisis, but climate change is in the center of the discussion. So I think it's an opportunity to advance from the status quo and really transform the economy so that it can face both economic and climate challenges.
Thank you. Now, just before I hand over to Hans-Gert, let me do a quick run through of what we've talked about today. Hans-Gert kicked off talking about the architecture of community and economy. And then we heard from Klaus speaking about past, present and future, the context in which we have to frame the green progress that Europe is now engaged in. And the consequence must be a stronger union as we move forward. We now live in and where American dominion is over and Europe has to forge a new path for itself also. And we heard from Josh about human influence as well. And I think we have characterized that there has clearly been a strong negative influence in the past, but we have an opportunity to move forward with a positive influence as well. We heard a lot from Christina on that too. Josh highlighted the emissions per person, which was particularly striking with China, US, India, and the EU, that despite one country, nation maybe being a big polluter, that doesn't translate exactly into equal polluting capability for each person in that country, and the policy should perhaps be directed accordingly as well. Christina spoke about the convergence of possibility and the positive impact from the pandemic as well, that there's an opportunity to reforge what we are doing and what we intend to do and why. And part of that is dependent on leadership and public service as well. So how we craft leadership and the output from the relationship between the citizen and leaders as well. Just spoke about CBAM, about competitiveness as well, and why that matters. The risk of greenwashing, how we need to avoid that, increasing transparency. Christina spoke about short-termism versus long-termism and the role of public-private partnerships as well, and how shareholders can change the mentality within corporations as well. Eva spoke about what happens when humans are stay at home as well, and that we discover the value of nature and to be able to reconnect with how we perceive nature as being a positive outcome from the pandemic as well. And she spoke also about the power of collective action, the positive elements as well as the negative elements too. Dasha spoke about the poverty line as well, how our citizens are at risk from various dynamics in this transition period as well, and what needs to be done to do that, but also the role of autocratic regimes and how transparency is needed to keep the excesses of maladministration at bay, and how what is perceived as an elitist agenda needs to be addressed with stronger communications as well. So monitoring transparency of recovery funds being a critical element of this as well. This is taxpayers' money and should be spent prudently and for the greater good. But anti-vax lessons of disinformation have to be applied to how we deal with the green and sustainable recovery as well. And a lot of explaining has got to be learnt and then applied during this process as well. And the hardships that many are facing, energy, food crisis, unemployment risks as well. These are not elements that have gone off the radar, but will be increasing challenges and will have to be dealt with accordingly as we move forward the green digital agenda as well. New skills being critical to that. John spoke about what we don't know about climate change as well. You know, we know certain elements, but we don't know what happens if this increases in certain paradigms, and the concept of CO2 and the atmosphere being free to use as a natural resource, how we price that, and putting this revenue back into the households as well, and the different dynamics of how that can be done. It was a lot of that was new to me, John, so I appreciate that today. And Dirk speaking about the big endeavor that we face and how we have to get away from 20th century fiscal modeling as well, that taxing labor is excessive, and we need to draw a different model for that as well. Give back to the people, not just as a slogan, but also as a practical, perceptible approach as well for Europe, and the concept of care as well, this eco-social contract, a policy value set for the modern age as well. Europe 2.0, well, the values shouldn't have changed. It's still a peace project, but coal and steel are out the window, and we have different tools to play with for this new generation, and the paradigm shift that engenders, and how we need to make sure that the whole of our communities move in together, that there is no one left behind as we advance with this and give the leadership. And Citizens Assembly highlighted as one of the dynamics that could well work for this as well. And so this is part of the challenge that we have, but also the opportunity. And I think that's what we take away from today. Yes, it's a big ask. And yes, as Vice President Timmermans says, it's bloody hard, but it's got to be done. So with that, Hans-Gert, back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Brian, for your really excellent moderation. You are an example of positive leadership. So leadership is important, but leadership for what? And it must be positive. And I thank you very much that you were again such an excellent moderator. Thank you, Brian. I want to thank our very intelligent panelists. For me, it was fascinating listening to you, and I learned a lot. And as long as we are ready to learn, we believe in the future. And so I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank the participants, especially our former members who are, as former members, still interested in the future. And I think this is what our task today is, to be interested in the future and to make proposals. And I think the most important thing is that we are optimistic. If we are pessimists, then we have lost already. And Jean Monnet, and he is for me one of the great leaders of the European project, he always said, Europe will be stronger with a crisis. And if the political leaders, the heads of government and the European Parliament, the Commission, take the right conclusions from those crises, then we become stronger. And the coronavirus is an example. Sorry, in the beginning of the corona crisis, some governments, including my government in Germany, were tempted to close the borders. But then we realized very soon that this is the wrong direction. And now I think everybody understands that the European Union needs some competences in the field of health as well. And so the crisis is an instrument that the European Union must become stronger. And my final word is, what I expect from European leadership is that our leaders, ladies or gentlemen, whosoever, who has responsibility, act on the basis of our European values. And these values are the dignity of the human being, freedom, democracy, the rule of law, and peace. And it's very vital that these values are defended by us in the European Union and outside. And we need to get the instruments as far as security is concerned to make the European Union stronger. And with these values, I'm deeply convinced we will have a good future, but the leaders must be ready to make the European Union stronger. And I hope that the conference on the future of Europe is one of those instruments to make the European Union stronger, because the European Union is a union of values, and this we have to defend internally and externally as well. And I thank all of you for your excellent contribution. Thank you so much.
Good. Thank you so much to, as always, energetic and positive, and the message that Europe needs to hear. So to all our panelists, thank you so much. Dirk has had to disappear right now. John, thank you. Eva and Dasha as well. And to you, our audience, for being so engaged today as well. We appreciate the time. So I wish you a good day. Thank you. And also to our team before they go as well, to Elizabeth and Lisette and the others as well. We appreciate that. Take care.